Hi, welcome back to Wednesday Chats with Eileen.
And Sean. I almost forgot my name for a second.
Don't worry, I'm here for you. And today we're going to talk about what does it mean to be a non-denominational church. So Sean, what does it mean to be a non-denominational church?
Should make me a little nervous when our executive pastor is asking the question.
Why, what did I join? It's too late now. No, just kidding.
But, no, it is an interesting thing because, I guess we should talk more about the impact it's had on us. First is okay. You didn't grow up non-denominational.
No, I did not. I grew up Assemblies of God.
Yeah, and I grew up Nazarene. And then, if we look back on, the last 5 or 6 or 7 elders we've had, your husband's an elder right now.
And he grew up LDS,
okay.
Latter-day Saints.
Yeah. We had one who's still an elder right now that I say he grew up an alcoholic. He didn't grow up in church. His family, his family religion is alcoholism.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. And we had another who didn't grow up in church at all, became Christian when he was in college. We had one that grew up Lutheran. Another one that grew up AG.
Okay.
And then I think one had gone here as long as I could remember, but I think he became a Christian when he was in his 20s. So it's not like anything that any of us even really grew up in.
That's true.
Which is a cool thing, and is actually kind of the thrust of this whole movement. Back there are these guys named Stone and Campbell, were their last names, and they were pastors.
Stoned?
No, Stone.
Oh,
Bart Stone or
so
Barton
that's
Stone.
That's the take on the growing up an alcoholic.
Yeah.
Stoned?
Yeah. No, it was far enough back.
Okay.
But Alexander Campbell. So, little funny factoid. Is right now we're a couple hundred yards from Western Oregon University, and one of the oldest buildings at Western is Campbell Hall.
Okay.
Because it's named after the nephew of Campbell of Stone and Campbell of Stone Campbell movement.
Wow, that's a fun fact.
Yeah, because one of the first presidents they had was his nephew, and basically it was a movement that they were pastors and they weren't allowed to get together. You know how churches can be sometimes.
No, I don't. Don't know that at all.
Their denominations didn't let them get together and take communion together.
That is so crazy. Isn't that crazy?
Yeah.
That was like that?
Yeah. It's not too far detached from a season when they would murder each other if they were part of different denominations, which is a whole different dark season of...
That's another podcast.
And they wanted to see a church where they were Barton Stone was one that really kind of pushed that the only label that they would use was disciples or Christians because nothing else mattered. And they used a lot of phrases that other denominations have used, where the Bible speaks, we speak, where the Bible's silent, we're silent. A lot of denominations claim to adhere to that. But I think one that was unique to the movement was... The
non-denominational movement is what you're talking about. Okay.
Yeah, unique to the non-denominational movement, which was also called, it was called the Stone Campbell movement. It was also called the Restoration movement because they thought they were restoring this unified early church. They would say not the only Christians, but Christians only was kind of the heart behind it. And that's really the commonality that I think you'll see in Christian churches. Now, unfortunately, that hasn't always been lived out well because now we have non-denominational Christian churches like us that are loosely affiliated, autonomous, almost always going to be elder-led governance are basically the commonalities. And then you have Church of Christ, right? And most of them are non-instrumental. And they're very closely related to Christian church.
You mean like they don't play instruments in their church?
Yeah.
Is that what you mean?
Yeah,
really?
non-instrumental Church of Christ. A whole nother podcast, but it's an interesting conversation. They
I wonder what they do with all those Bible verses about playing the harp and the lyre. And
they say it's all Old Testament. and that in the New Testament, there's no teaching or example of them playing instruments. Now, they built out a theology, and I love Church of Christ Brothers, but in reality, if you look back to the history, it had a lot more to do with economics, because Church of Christ churches were largely Southern churches, post-Civil War, Reconstruction, a lot of poverty, and there was this new instrument entering into churches, this saloon instrument.
Piano?
The piano. And they were expensive, and Southern churches couldn't afford them, and they thought that they were excessive if a church spent money on them, and Northern churches did, so they became largely Christian churches.
Gotcha.
But then you also have Disciples of Christ. So it's the sad thing is it's supposed to be this unifying movement that is fractured.
Split to it's all different. Typical human history.
Yeah, and so I mean, really, that's the thrust behind the whole thing, and I think there's a regrowing energy around non-denominational churches to try and be just that, just not the only Christians, but Christians only, leaving space for people who have different views on spiritual gifts, on end time stuff, on, even across the spectrum on women in ministry and egalitarian versus complementarian views, governance, all these different things. And just to say that the only thing that really matters is that we're disciples of Jesus and that we're proclaiming his name and obedient to the Great Commission. And so... Yeah,
the rub is, it's always the rub is you can claim certain things, but then once you have to actually walk them out and live them out, that's the messy part.
Yeah.
And I think it's easier to live with a set box of this is what we believe, this is what we think, this is what we feel, and let's all check. I believe this, I agree with this. Because there's no mess. There's no arguing. There's no tension. There's no rubbing. It's just like we all agree. Woo!
Yeah.
And then when you're in a non-denominational church, you have a big variety of opinions on things. And it's stretching. You have to really choose to say what is really the bottom line of my Christianity. Everything else is not worth trying to be disunified over. It's just extra stuff. I read a paper by some really old guys. They're all dead now, like in 1928, and they were fighting about, discussing things that were separating them, and they were Christian groups. And they made a statement in there after 60 pages of how they were talking about how they were going to get along. But one of the statements one guy said, the only thing that I think should be a cause for an argument for discord was, does it cause me to not be able to worship God, and does it cause me to not be able to obey him? Yeah. And if it doesn't fall into those two categories, then it's all the external thing, and it's not worth discord over. Yeah.
Yeah, I recently came across a quote that expresses that same kind of sentiment in how you live it out, and the person said, I don't agree with them, but I believe Christ is in them. And I think that kind of focusing on the truth that the Spirit is in them and that we don't have to agree on everything. And, not only in our eldership, but in our staff, having grown up AG, grew up Nazarene, our worship pastor grew up Foursquare.
Yeah, there's a big variety of opinions coming into the pot.
And having to find ways to balance that tension. And I think that it makes for a more beautiful body because you learn from everybody. You're challenged in the assumptions you made. We were having this conversation just a couple months ago about how sometimes you grow up assuming the Bible says certain things just because you were always told it. And then you start looking and you're like,
what?
There's one obscure verse.
Yeah, for sure.
I mean, the one for us, if we're going to talk non-denominational Christian church history, is taking communion every week. There's like one obscure reference, and then we've made it this like law, but we all challenge each other and we grow, and hopefully we grow closer to Christ.
Like iron sharpens iron.
Yeah.
You have to have some rubbing and friction to sharpen yourself.
Yeah.
And so if you're in a group of a herd of people all thinking, spouting the same thing, going the same direction, it's calm, but there's no growth.
Yeah.
So
hopefully this little chatter helps you understand a little bit more about what it means to be part of a non-denominational Christian church. And wherever you are, whether you're at a non-denominational or denominationally affiliated church. We do hope that you're in a place that's iron's going to sharpen iron. You're going to grow in your faith, and that we can all walk together as the universal global church together towards Christ and glorifying Him. Love you guys.
See ya.